Welcome to the Humanists of Greater Portland. My name's Al Christians, and I am your MC today because my wife is on her way to Crater Lake. But she gave me a script. Or as the famous humanist Kurt Vonnegut put it in the disclaimer on one of his books, all persons, living or dead, are purely coincidental and should not be construed. But there's something important about that. The point is that we've got 40 brains all working here today, and all we're giving you is the picture and the audio. And the meaning you have to create in your own head. So we're like a factory of 40 people all creating meaning related to our own human potential today. And isn't that wonderful? Humanism is a philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. Humanists like those gathered here today attempt to live the best life we can envision because this is the only life of which we are certain. Humanism affirms the dignity of all people and the need to treat our fellow humans as our equals. Humanists value people not only for all that they have accomplished in art, science, and humanity, but also simply for their human potential. Our topic this morning, Stories of Leaving Religion, especially addresses humanist commitment of critical thinking. Okay, now it's time for you to tune in and turn on.
Apropos. Pete wrote this. I'm thankful for my feelings, even when they get hurt. I'm thankful for my dreaming, even when I know it won't work. I'm thankful for my memories, even when I remember pain. 'Cause there's so many things that I have done that I'll never do again. A lady came to see me, my old feelings were still there. She said that she had found someone for whom she really cared. I tried to hide my suffering as I wished her peace and joy. But now hope is gone, nobody's ever gonna stay with this old boy. But I'm thankful for my feelings, even when they get hurt. I'm thankful for my dreaming, even when I know it won't work. I'm thankful for my memories, even when I remember pain. 'Cause there's so many things that I have done that I'll never do again. You can't stop the world from turning, and it won't always turn your way. So you got to build a philosophy to get you through the longer days. You can't make somebody love you or promise to be there. So learn to love without demands, and you live without a care. Then you'll be thankful for your feelings, even when they get hurt. You'll be thankful for your dreaming, even when you know it won't work. Just like I'm thankful for my memories, even when I remember pain. 'Cause there's so many things that I have done that I'll never do again. So many roads that I have run that I'll never run again. Said there's so many times that I have cried, I don't ever want to cry again. That's why I'm thankful for my feelings, even when they get hurt. I'm thankful for my dreaming, even when I know it won't work. I'm thankful for my memories, even when I remember pain. 'Cause there's so many things that I have done that I'll never do again.
Which brings up Doug Matheson, our speaker today, who is a member of the HGP. And he's going to present Taking New Paths, the stories of people leaving religion. Doug has an interesting background for a humanist. Doug grew up in India as a member of a Christian missionary family in India. He attended Seventh-day Adventist schools from elementary school through college. As a young adult, he worked for the church, I assume that means Seventh-day Adventist, as a science teacher, and later as a public health worker in Rwanda. He quietly left the faith. Today's presentation is part of his graduate study research in social anthropology, which studied the process of exiting religion, and that graduate study was not in an Adventist university. It was at Goldsmiths University of London, London being in England, I presume. And he also has a master's degree from Goldsmiths U of London and another master's from the University of Oregon. So please welcome Doug Matheson to come talk to us of stories of leaving religion.
Thank you, guys. I first set foot in your little community about 10 years ago, just one time. I wasn't living in Portland then, and I thoroughly enjoyed that introduction. When I moved back here much more recently, I said, I've got to start to rejoin, but COVID had us shut down from any live human interaction. So when it opened back up, I came a few times, and I've come more recently, and I have to say I've enjoyed the fellowship every single time I've come. And so this book, which I'm going to share a bit about, really grew out of my graduate research at the University of London in the school year 2019-2020. Well, you can look at me and say, what the heck is a guy already in his early 60s going back to graduate school for? And so I want to, there could be loose screws that make somebody make a decision like that, but I want to explain a little bit about what drove me. I had grown up deeply within conservative religion and had liked it for the most part. I hadn't rebelled terribly. I was a lively character, so I had done my share of little rebellions as a teenager, but I went through Adventist schools as a missionary kid, went to high school in Singapore, came back, went to Walla Walla College, an Adventist college, and liked it, and started working for the church and liked it. But I hit some bumps in the road along the way, and I viewed them then as very constructive bumps. During my freshman year, first year in college, in some science classes, I was struggling with the butting of heads between things I cherished beliefs and apparently what good evidence was. One of the first to pop up in my experience was simply the Noah's flood idea. And I'd grown up with the ark and the animals 2 by 2 and all that beautiful stuff. And I hadn't known zip about the science. And here I was bumping into the science, even though the church professors were trying to be very gentle about it, giving us ways of saying, well, we can interpret it this way, we can interpret it that way. I began to struggle more, and I realized that I realized in hindsight was sort of the Robert Frost, two roads diverged in the woods, because I said, if my ideas, my beliefs, my claims butt heads with good verifiable evidence, the only honest thing to do is impose the evidence on my beliefs and be willing to change my beliefs. But I was surrounded by an institution, an immediate family, an extended family, and an academic family in that church college, which I realized they always find ways of imposing their beliefs on the evidence. You either ignore it or dismiss it or cherry pick from it, and you find ways of imposing your beliefs on the evidence. And I, as a 19-year-old, I came to the difficult position of saying, that's not honest. That's just not honest. I'm going to find ways of imposing the evidence on my beliefs, modifying my beliefs, but trying hard to hang on to the cores of my beliefs. And so I went down that path for a decade and a half of adult life, constantly modifying the claims I made while trying to hang on to core stuff. I'll give you one little side trivial example. As a youngster, I heard the biblical story of the 40 kids making fun of the bald-headed Elisha. And what did God do about it? You know, get some she-bears down there and tear up those kids. And as a kid, I just thought, whoa, you know, don't make fun of God's leading people. Okay? I mean, literally, that's what I thought. But as an adult who began to modify what I found believable about God, I don't believe that about God. A good God would not do that. Likewise with the flood idea. As I struggled with the science of it, I suddenly stepped back and said, man, the theology of it's even worse. Why would a good character God be able to say, hey, I don't like how the game's going. I'm going to erase the scoreboard and I'm going to start again at 0 with a team I like. And everybody else just gets, you know, wiped off the board. And I said to my dad, and I said to some college professors, I don't buy it. I don't believe that about God. I think the whole flood story, scientifically and theologically, is bogus. So I kept trying to hang on to the good God I thought was there with a whole boatload of misunderstanding about him. But as I said, by the time I reached my mid-30s, slightly past 35, I had modified so many things. Patiently, and I finally said, I realize now I've been just playing a game, and I'm out. And so I came back from Rwanda, having done 3.5 years of public health work there for the church I'd grown up in. And what precipitated the coming back was we were there when the genocide got going. In any case, I said to my wife, I'm done working for the church. I'm not anymore. And she asked me a few questions about why, but I could tell she didn't like the answers. So it wasn't something that we discussed much. And I was not on a soapbox remotely. It was silent to myself. I silently left the faith. I just said, I'm not going to work for that organization. I'm still going to be a good dad to my 2 little kids. I'm married to a woman that I had loved, and things were becoming strained because of my fundamental changes, and that wasn't her fault. And so I left faith. But in the decades after that, I kept running into other people who were no longer believers, and some of them had very unfraught experiences. They just left. But some of them had extremely difficult experiences. And I tuned into a lot of that and began to wonder about it. And then when I first retired as a teacher in Oregon, I spent a year in Oman, just teaching English as a second language. I went there because I simply wanted to live in a society surrounded by Muslims for an extended period of time, because I kept running into good Christian Americans whose perception was Muslims are closed-minded and evil. And I said, yeah, I don't believe either of those things. I'm going to go live there and experience it. And in living there, I got to know a number of Muslims who, in private, one-on-one, would say to me, I would be done with my faith, but I can't. I would lose my kids. My parents would, I mean, it's just an impossibility. And so I became more and more aware of the fraught nature of exiting faith, that many people didn't have it as relatively easy as I had it. For me, it was just a slow, gradual thing until the straw that broke the camel's back, and then I was out. And so in my early 60s, I said, you know what? I know so many stories out there already. I'd like to collect them. I'd like to make this book. But I said, I don't have the academic background to do a good, thorough job as an anthropologist, because this is really a piece of anthropology. And so I said, you know what? I'm going to go do a master's degree in anthropology, get somewhat academic, it's not a PhD, but get somewhat academically grounded. And I focused my research while there on the religion exiting process. Jerry kind of mentioned our conversation and your contribution. I wanted to catch you earlier and ask that in private, but I met Jerry before I went to London, and he and I had some wonderful conversations, and I shared with him that I had this idea of putting together an anthology, and he had an interesting story on his own part. And so as I was in London and pulling stories together for my dissertation, Jerry was among many who gave me some material, and part of Jerry's story helped set this book off to a thought-provoking start, because part of his story is in the introduction to this book. So I gave you my story in somewhat of an extended nutshell. Okay. All right. The dedication here I share, and not many things I'm going to share word for word, but to really give you an idea of my first target group, which is, it's hard to find these people. So anyway, this book is dedicated to all those who have experienced, are experiencing, or will experience the deep internal confusion of reevaluating the traditions and beliefs they grew up with, and the sense of loneliness that too often goes with that process. That's who I really hope to reach. Okay. But it's hard to immediately find those people. I realize many of you might have had your exit experience, and so you are among those who experienced this. And hopefully, if you get your hands on this, you'll find it interesting, even if you aren't among the people who I think could tremendously benefit from it. And though the benefit group is the people who are in the middle of it, feeling lonely, feeling still confused, trying to sort it out. So I'm going to briefly introduce you to a bunch of authors. This is pictures of 8 of the 18 authors. 11 of the authors chose to use their real name. 7 of them chose to use a pseudonym. I encouraged them in making that decision to really not feel bad. If you need a pseudonym, use it. And interestingly, all 3 of the Muslims who share their stories in here, all 3 of them chose to use pseudonyms, and I don't blame them, and I don't blame anybody who chose to use a pseudonym. People from a wide variety of faiths chose to use pseudonyms. So I wanted you to be able to picture a few people as I share little snippets about their story. So the first 2 people are on the first third of the table of contents that I'm going to share with you. Elizabeth, hard to picture somebody there, but this is also a picture of her. She is now in her early 30s on the West Coast. And Lauren there, and I don't know if you can see this picture. Anybody, this reincarnation of a phone booth says, talk to God. And that's the picture she had taken of herself at Burning Man. She grew up in an ultra-Orthodox Jewish community in Greater New York. Okay. and was faithful through that into her early 20s, and then processed her stuff. So Elizabeth grew up in small town, rural Oregon. I got to know her about a dozen years ago. I had founded an organization called Klamath Bay Without Borders, and we would do spring break projects in developing countries through Habitat for Humanity. And it was just a way, in my mind, of helping American kids widen their horizons to other countries, other cultures, and do something constructive in the process. And she was a part of one of those groups, one of the most thinking, puzzling. She would ask me deep questions. She would ask in conversation with locals without trying to, because at that time she was still a loyal Catholic. She didn't try imposing her faith. She didn't try evangelizing, which was part of our group rule. We're not there to evangelize in any way. We're there to help them build reliable, inexpensive housing, and we can ask them lots of questions about their culture and try to understand their culture. So Elizabeth was just a wonderful part about that. She then went to college, and part of her college experience, unfortunately, put her through some really tough times personally. And reevaluating religion and the notion of God was part of dealing with those tough times. So that's my snippet on her. Lauren, the ultra-Orthodox Jew by background, her story to me was tremendously interesting because I hadn't ever been able to picture the details of growing up in America, but so closed off from America. I grew up in a fairly insular community, Seventh-day Adventist can be, but that's nothing compared to ultra-Orthodox Judaism, a really different way of growing up, and to then grow out of that takes tremendous courage. And perseverance, and it's not an easy process. All right, I'm going to touch on some of the others in the first 6 chapters that are not pictured there. The young lady, well, much of her story was when she was a young lady. She's now in her 50s. By the way, just quick overview. 9 of these authors are in their 30s and 40s. 2 are in their 20s, 3 in their 50s, 2 in 60s. And one gentleman, one in 70s, and one gentleman turned 98 this last August. And he's still kicking and doing well. We talk occasionally on the phone. He's a wonderful man. Sorry, that was an unplanned side. So she was born in early childhood in Bangladesh and then moved to the Middle East because her parents were professors. And so she grew up going to nice schools in Kuwait, in Dubai, and locations like that, and thrived as a student. Came to the US for some university time, got accepted to medical school, became a doctor, was doing her residency in New York City when 9/11 happened. And she had already done some roller coastering in terms of the strength of her belief and the intensity of her belief as a Muslim before that. And 9/11 helped precipitate more, but it wasn't an immediate turn away. She found ways for a while of getting more serious in her faith before ultimately a whole series of steps of reevaluation. And a rich story. All right. This gentleman grew up in the Deep South, immersed in American evangelical Christianity, singing the songs. I loved how you were waving your hands like the imitation of good old gospel stuff. That's what he grew up with. And as a teenager, he was already part of the church music leadership group and grew in that, and then went to college to study theology. Ultimately went to England to do a master's in divinity. and had his first child born while they were in England. And his is a very academic reevaluation. For him, the things he began to realize in the details about the simplifications that we Christians broadly make about Scripture that are just built on a foundation of sand. And so his was still very interesting, very deeply personal. Fortunately for him, his wife was able to make the transition in lockstep with him. So there was a joint exodus there that didn't break up a family. This gentleman I got to know as a teaching colleague. He was in the same school I was for a number of years, and we slowly, in just random casual conversations, figured out that, oh, we're both ex-believers. In his case, he was an ex-Mormon. I was an ex-Seventh-day Adventist. Some people actually confuse the groups sometime. And I learned more about his story. And when I went to London to do my research, I got back a hold of him and said, hey, I know you have an interesting story to tell. Would you be willing to tell it? And he said, heck yeah. So he tells his deep, rich story here. All right, so we touched on these two already. This is a gentleman I found by continuing, because part of my search, I joined many ex-something groups on Facebook, ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, ex-Hindus, and when I would join the group, many times there's a clause like, who are you, what's your background, do you agree to our rules? And I was always honest with the group saying, I'm doing research on religious exits, and I'm an ex-Seventh-day Adventist. I'm not an ex-Mormon. When I was joining Mormon groups, and likewise with the Hindus, and only one group said, no, we don't want you asking our people questions. So, that leaves many groups where people told me, sure, you can. So then I would post a statement there of what I was doing and asked if anybody was interested in potentially telling me their story. If they were, then I sent them a good page, sort of a guide. Here's roughly, here's the word length, and don't try to tailor it to anybody else's expectations. All our stories are going to be different. Be free and take the responsibility of just telling your truth. Don't try to fit it to anything else. So he grew up in Northeast India, became an engineer, and part of what helped or troubled him about staying in Hinduism was that he was in a privileged people group. He had gone to private schools. He was in an upper caste. And what troubled him was the social injustice intrinsic to Hinduism. And that was his catalyst to get him going and asking questions and ultimately being out. Okay, I'm going to go back to this and show you pictures of a couple people on the second page. So this picture, and he's got a modified guitar here that I've seen him in little videos he posts play this. Some of you might know the name. I'm not a musician, so I don't know what the name of that is. He's a young man in Lebanon, Maron, and the other person. So where's Casey in my pictures here? Casey has an interesting dual exit experience. He grew up a Mormon and left that, but very quickly after leaving, joined evangelical far-right American Christianity, married a young lady within that. And after a number of years there, ultimately left that too. So his story is interesting in a number of ways. And Yui, and I apologize for the picture, but she's an artist, creative, has a crazy bent. The other picture she sent me was actually one that she had drawn of herself, but as a cat. and creative and funny, but it just didn't fit. Anyway, she grew up in Singapore. She's generations younger than I am. So we never crossed paths in Singapore when I was there. But she was in London and part of the same cohort I was. She was in the same academic year, same focus, social anthropology. So we got to know each other really well in London. And I learned too that she has an interesting story. And her story is kind of one of the only ones here where she hasn't conclusively come down as a secular humanist atheist. She's still, and she's been many things: Buddhist, Taoist, Catholic, um, not Lutheran, another mainstream Methodist. Okay, so she's been in many faiths and exited each of them on the way. So she has an interesting story to tell that's different than the usual too. Okay. Pass this to page 2. So this is me, and I've already given you my version in a nutshell. The Jehovah's Witness person here, there are 2 Jehovah's Witnesses in the book. This one is Laura. She's in California still and grew up in California. And until the age of 12, she actually grew up Catholic. But her mom then converted from Catholicism to Jehovah's Witness. And so then from the age of 12 through to in her 50s, she was an active, loyal Jehovah's Witness, and then finally found her way out of that with some of the extreme difficulties of the shunning that happens, that if you know, that they'll break up families in a heartbeat because they don't give access. It doesn't matter if you're a parent and a child. If one person leaves, you're to consider them dead and gone. Really, my heart goes out to people who leave that faith. Really, there's 2 faiths that I find the strongest empathy for: people leaving Islam and people leaving Jehovah's Witness. They can have it insanely tough. All right. Down here, my tapestry of change. Again, a pseudonym. I know him personally. He goes in the book as Hekmat. I met him in 2012-ish. I'd have to look it up again. At Berkeley, they have an annual international critical thinking conference. And both of us were there the first time we met as simple participants. The second year we were there, we were both presenting. So he has a PhD in English and lived and grew up in Iran. And only within the last 2 years has he gotten out. And they managed to get visas to come to the US because his wife is a medical doctor and the US is short of doctors. So they gave his wife, the necessary green card stuff to come over here. She's now in the process of finishing her US training because they sort of accept the doctor training. But anyway, his experience is really one of the stories that touches more into sort of philosophy than most. He grew up a loyal Muslim, but he, in his getting a PhD in English, was exposed to literature of a wide variety of types. And it was exposure to different philosophical ways of looking at life that sort of put him on a different path. I already shared with you her. She's the one from Singapore who was in the same cohort as me in Singapore. And we have the other person I showed you the picture who grew up Mormon and then switched to evangelical and then on out. Okay, quickly back to the pictures so I'm hoping the pictures helps make this just a little more real for you. On the 3rd page, we're going to have Kunal. Whoops, I went back too far. Kunal, someone whose dad was a Sikh and whose mom was a Hindu. And I got to know him simply, again, by internet searching and joining groups. And he was doing a very interesting thing in India. He started a YouTube channel where he would openly discuss atheism and encourage and invite discussion. So courageous guy. He just moved to Canada about 6 months ago. So he's no longer in India. All right. Kathy is our one author that's in her 70s. I got to know her, and I still have not met her in real life, but probably 7-ish years ago on Facebook through mutual friends, because by coincidence, she went to the very same academy that I went to in Singapore. I was there in the first half of the 70s. She was there in the first half of the 60s. And her parents were Seventh-day Adventist missionaries, just like my parents were Seventh-day Adventist missionaries. And her story of change, she stayed in even longer than I did. She stayed in until her 50s, when one of her sons came out and said, "Hey, I'm gay." And she was able to accept that. And to her surprise, her husband, who had been very rigid about so many things within faith and religion and practice and belief, was not rigid in this case. And that surprised her. And then and I forget, I'd have to go back to this, whether it was months later or a couple years later, she got a big surprise, her husband. You can guess, I won't spoil the story. All right, and Todd. Sorry, very small picture here. He has been a really fun person for me to interact with. He's an attorney in New York who grew up not ultra-Orthodox Jew, but what they now call, so where am I going to find Todd again? Chapter 17, I think. Yeah, modern Orthodox Jew. A lot more liberal than ultra-Orthodox, but still strong believer. Grew up with that. His brother trained to become a rabbi. Okay, and as far as I remember the story, his brother's still a rabbi. But he got overwhelmed with too much stuff to say, I can stay in this. No, and ultimately he's out, and he's done a lot of good active things in the greater New York area in terms of helping people who find themselves alone because they've left their whole social circle to restart life in constructive ways. All right. So we already talked a bit about him. By the way, one of the triggers for him too was he believes in social justice, and he found that Hinduism and the caste system, again in particular, just falls on its face. And for him, it was a key thing in being out. I gave you her story. This Muslim is in South Africa. During his formative years, he was sent to boarding schools, sometimes in Pakistan, sometimes in the Middle East. So he had a rich upbringing in the fundamentals of Islam, and then trained to be a mullah, and did a master's degree in Islamic studies at a university run by Muslims in South Africa. His various reasons for exiting really had to do with sort of the scriptural analysis kind of stuff that I mentioned. One of our Christian guys that doing his MDiv in England said, no, I can no longer buy this stuff. This woman was born in Canada to a woman who had recently immigrated from Jamaica and was struggling. And the Jehovah's Witness local community they use a term that I didn't know until reading these stories: love bombing. that when somebody's struggling and you want to get them into your community, you just bring them in and love the heck out of them. And they feel like, I've found family, I've found truth and all that. And so her mom came into Jehovah's Witnesses. And so she then, from birth onward, was surrounded by all of that. And she managed to find the exit in her early 20s. Say, no, I'm out. There's too much here that I'm not going to continue to swallow. This is Todd, our attorney in New York City, who's deeply thoughtful, the number of people in this who are MDs or PhDs or attorneys or pharmacists, it's a really well-educated group of people. This is Chuck, our 98-year-old, who's in Southern Oregon, and I first met him when I was probably not quite 50 and he was about 80, and my dad had long since died. And a 50-year-old doesn't really need a dad, but Chuck and I related so well on so many levels, and I finally started saying to him, Chuck, I don't need a dad, but to me, you're like a father figure, because he's just a wonderful guy, and he tells a story from the background of Scientology or Christian Science. Interesting stuff. All right.
I was reading an Andrew Sullivan article about religion, and he posits that the political parties, the extremes, the Trump side and the social justice warriors, are religions. Do you is that would you see it that way? I'm just as a question.
Sure. I think the cult-like nature of the Trump base very much is like a among the worst of religions, and I'm being judgmental there, but I'm being honest. The more cult-like, where you try to insulate from outside ideas, you try to cultivate a reflex tendency to dismiss those outside ideas. I think it's a good fit. I think it can be called that. And by the way, there's good reading out there to be done on the religious right. Actually, the Republican Party's choice and decision to say we need issues like abortion to help us grow a blind following. And C Street is one of the books that would be productive reading there.
Okay, we have a question typed in from Zoom by David Beam, who's one of the stalwarts on the 8:45 a.m. Sunday discussion group we have here at HGP, and he asks, any interactions with Scientologists? I assume he's wanting to know if you can.
So no, not all. My acquaintanceship there is distant and superficial. I do not have any firsthand stuff. You know, Chuck Wells in Klamath Falls. I misspoke in saying Scientology there. I think it was simply Christian Science, and I should have all of my religion stuff carefully cataloged, but after a while it becomes a giant fog and you say,
yeah. Okay, number two, Hank Robb at the mic.
So first of all, I grew up in Texas, and down there we would call you a damn troublemaker, boy.
I have friends and relatives who still do.
And the other thing is, I wondered why you didn't title your book How I Turned to the Dark Side. But aside from those, one of the things that I find most problematic is that there's a lot of talk about religion, but not supernaturalism generally. And I spent some time in California where people are moving crystals around and doing things that don't have anything to do with religion, but they have a lot to do with supernaturalism. And I wondered if you had thought anybody as a social anthropologist about supernaturalism generally rather than specifically within religion.
So, yes, personally, yeah, and I've read a fair amount on it. I sort of have in mind maybe someday a second edition of this with a whole bunch of new stories. I'd like to include some from animist backgrounds, and some of the New Age stuff would be good to include too, because I think sometimes people get into various things like that and ultimately get out of it, and some of them don't get out of it. I'm going to quickly add this, that I don't actually make a point here or straight from me of saying I think everybody should become an atheist, because that's not my push. For a while I kind of felt that way, but I began to realize that that quickly throws up walls infinitely, and it tears down bridges, such that I now really say what I ask of people of faith is to become aware of and self-monitor against 4 risks that I've identified that really go with fundamentalist faith, so that I think somebody can be a Catholic or a Lutheran or a Hindu or a Jew or a Muslim or any number of things, including playing with crystals and some of that nebulous stuff. You can have those kind of beliefs in relatively harmless ways if you'll self-monitor so as to not take the risks that have historically gone with that stuff, because the risks that go with fundamentalist faith, I think, are clear and quite easily identified. If you simply say atheism makes me feel empty, and so I'm going to hang on to something, I'm willing to say, okay, cool, I get it. Not everybody is that hard-nosed that maybe they don't want to, they can't stand the idea of there not being some supernatural force that's intelligent. I think they have an extremely hard time if they want to attribute benevolence to whatever's all out there, because as Neil deGrasse Tyson shares in one quick video, it's like, man, the universe is out to smack you around. Okay, so the notion of benevolence falls on its face among human history and in the universe broadly. So, for me, I just find no more reason for hope. And by the way, when I first left faith, when my wife would occasionally push me on where I was, are you a hardcore atheist? I said at one point, I'm no longer a believer. You're right, but I'm not a hardcore atheist. I call myself a hoper. I hope there is a God, and that was a genuine statement. I'd love there to be a benevolent blah 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 blah, but I'm so overwhelmingly struck by the lack of verifiable evidence toward any of that I just shrug my shoulders and say, hey, we're here now. I'd like there to be a civilized society that people can enjoy 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, 100,000 years from now, 1,000,000 years from now. We don't have a right to so irrevocably screw things up now that there can't be human beings enjoying a life 1,000 years from now or 1,000,000 years from now. We don't have the right to just things up. Pardon my French. And when I'm talking with young people, I sometimes say, hey, on behalf of my generation, I apologize from the bottom of my heart, because I feel like I'm on the, in another 20 years, chances are I'm out the door. I feel like we're passing you a baton saying, good luck. And that ain't right. And I reassure young people that there are many people my generation, I'm looking at you, who want to, in our remaining years, leave you as minimal a dumpster fire as we can find ways of doing. And I think among the risks that have gone with fundamentalist faith, one of them is that everything is in God's hands. That's both in Christianity and in Islam, a big thing. If you've heard, inshallah, God willing, everything's just God's will. That's what happens. And because everything's in God's hands, I'm just a drop in the bucket. I can't do anything effectual with any of the challenges we face. And so I just shrug and say, I'll drive a gas guzzling monster and not recycle and just because you know what the real solution is? Jesus is coming soon. And you get to shrug off responsibility instead of take responsibility. That's one of the four risks that I think still goes with crystal stuff and new age stuff. If you think that the supernatural is going to solve things, you haven't gotten around to saying evidence matters. And evidence matters when it comes to climate change. Evidence matters when it comes to seeing Earth's place in the Milky Way and in the universe. And as awe-inspiring as all that is, don't think that you need to say, oh, there's a great spirit somewhere, because there we're letting ourselves get imaginations rolling. Yeah, the only other, so this slide has been up for long enough. I'm not going to do these two slides because that was if anybody wanted to see, and if anybody hangs around, that was the letter that I sent people if they said, hey, yeah, I'd be interested in telling my story. This is just some reviews, but let us focus on questions.
Hold on up. We have we have next a question that Val Humble typed in, which is, what fraction of those leaving religion do it for logical reasons versus those disappointed with the virtues of the religion?
My research didn't involve any statistical comparisons, so I only have an off-the-cuff thing. I think there's plenty of both, because one guy who almost started to tell me his story, and then he said, no, I already knew enough. His story involved tons of trauma, and there's a second story I also got that involved a bunch of sexual abuse trauma, and I simply chose not to tell them. And that's not to say there are not traumatic things out there, but among over 30 stories that I collected, most that I collected from these communities of exes didn't involve, and they may have been difficult. I have a whole book of Muslim, and it's not a book I put together, it's stories of focus just on Islamic exits. And many of those are really, really difficult processes, but don't involve abuse. And there's plenty of cases where there was real abuse of various types going on. But in my experience, those are not the majority. In my experience, there are tons more reasons. The Adventist Academy I went to in Singapore, we have an alumni group that's active on Facebook, and there's plenty of alumni who, when I shared this book, there were a lot of people saying, whoa, about time, and happy to see it. Okay. And there were other people saying, this is the devil's work.
Okay, next, Jules has his hand up. Jules is going to ask a very good question. My wife told me he's one of the best questioners we have now, that he's learned the routine excellently. Jules, come on in and ask a question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Okay. First of all, your astute insights into this whole subject is to be applauded. I mean, you lived it, and the book is a manifestation of a true willingness to share that whole experience. And for those of us, I mean, you're bringing coals to Newcastle by talking to this group, but so be it. My question is, and I'll preface it with one more thing. When they looked at the elections in 2020, the predictions were not what the outcome was. As you know, all of, except for one backer of Mr. T, did not do well. And what it said was people wouldn't openly discharge their allegiance to Mr. T, but when they got into the ballot box, they in fact did what they firmly believe was the right thing to do. So here's the question. In all of your interviews, was the fear factor a major underlying reason for them not to do it the next day? It took months, years, life's experiences to push them saying, I got to live with it. Whatever the ramifications are, I'm going to go forward. Fear.
So, yeah, the fear factor is very significant. And I would say that in my experience, not just my personal experience, but my experience getting to know many people who have stories to tell, the fear factor pumped the brakes. But it tipped, of course, if the fear factor managed to completely put on the brakes and they didn't exit, then I didn't cross their story, right? So
Right.
I don't have a complete data set there, but I see the fear factor as often slowing things down. You know, and I think it's unfortunate when it slows it down if it prolongs the suffering, if it prolongs the sense of confusion, it prolongs the sense of loneliness. But I wouldn't want people to make decisions the first time they had a doubt. This needs to be somewhat slow cooked on a back burner, I think, though I think I cooked mine on the back burner way longer than necessary.
Okay, we have another question online from Elizabeth, who typed in a kind of a long question, but I'll try to condense it here. She says that a lot of your authors defected from more extreme or immersive types of religion. Do you have much interaction with people who have been members of gentler forms of religion?
So it's interesting to hear that called extreme, because while I look at the Jehovah's Witnesses as a pretty extreme cult, and I look at fundamental Orthodox Judaism as pretty extreme, if it's ultra Orthodox, I look at strong Islam, and there are plenty of Muslims who are kind of like plenty of Catholics that you're okay, check the box. And that's pretty much all. I have Southern Baptist here, but it was evangelical flavored. So I say, okay, that may be a bit stronger. That maybe most Lutherans and Anglicans are a bit more moderate. So it's possible that.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to clarify my question. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I guess mostly what I was looking to see is there like kind of a higher likelihood that somebody is going to defect from a religion that hello everybody, tends to be like, I know Catholicism has a lot of rules, I know Orthodox Judaism has a lot of rules, and it's very like, it's kind of all or nothing. At least that's my perception of it. Whereas like mainline Protestantism is kind of put forward as like a kinder, gentler Christianity, like, we ordain women and we support the LGBT community, like that kind of thing. Like, have you interacted a lot with those kinds of uh faiths, or is it primarily just like these more like kind of all-encompassing rule-based type of
So
situations?
my authors tend to be people who I knew ahead of time they had an interesting story to tell, or I found them by joining groups of X this, X that, X the other thing. That's how I got my group. My observation on that would be that if somebody grew up just loosely nominally Catholic and just kind of faded, or if somebody grew up loosely nominally Anglican and just kind of faded, or they grew up, somebody give me another name of a rather gentle, but one of, the Singapore girl spent some time in Methodism. That if you have people from those soft, wishy-washy, they're not going to be ever part of an X group. They just faded. They just faded. And so most of them don't have, never mind deeply traumatic. I've had people who I got to know, they were an X something, and when I asked them about it, they looked at me nutty and said, "I don't have an interesting story to tell. I just left." Well, that was the end of that. And it's like completely non-thought provoking, completely non-emotive. It was just like, well, I left.
Okay, we'll move on to question 3 from Friendly House.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation, Doug. Very interesting. I had an acquaintance some years ago who said he was atheist and then moved to some kind of religion or supernaturalism. I really didn't know him well enough to question him much about that, but have you encountered anybody like that?
I haven't. Certainly, I know plenty of people who've left religion X and gone to religion Y. Growing up in India, my circle from which I could tap them and say, "Hey, do you have an interesting story to tell?" Many of them are Adventists now who were Hindus back then, and their parents converted, they were baptized by the good missionaries, of which my parents were, some of the good missionaries. Okay. So people switch religions. I know Muslims who started out as Christians. I know Christians who started out as Muslims. I know the cross wiring, and that I acknowledge in my preface. That's not what I chose. I'm not looking at why people change faiths. This is a bunch of stories of people who essentially left faith. And that's all it is.
Okay, we have another question in Friendly House.
Okay. So the
Sorry.
the first thing is I have a little soapbox about the word faith, and that is that people are stealing our language. Now, when I grew up, faith meant belief in things unseen. So if you have a child and start a college fund, that's an act of faith. You don't know the kid's going to go to college. You don't even know the kid's going to live that long. So the first thing is, the question is not who are the people of faith. We all are. The question is, what is our faith in? Similarly, I have a long background story that I won't tell you, but it has to do with being a believer. And I had found myself describing myself as, I'm not a believer in the supernatural. So yes, I'm a believer. I'm just not a believer in the supernatural. And finally, there's a lot of research that's been done over the last 20 or so years at Johns Hopkins on psychedelics. And one of the experiences that people have is a very profound experience of what the researchers there call something precious, not something sacred. And I wonder if that distinction might be one that would be useful in talking with people who have something precious. They just don't like the story other people are telling about it.
Interesting. I like your clarification that you're not a believer in supernatural, and I relate to that myself, because certainly I have confidence in various things. You could say I have faith in various things, but I don't resort to, if you look back 500 years and you do sort of a Venn diagram, the things we understand and the things we don't understand, and therefore that we attribute to supernatural. 500 years ago, the circle of things that we didn't understand and we attributed to the supernatural was just gigantic, almost everything. And over the centuries, the circle of things that we do understand in detail, what's going on inside of the sun and inside of stars, and how those stars form, and how the very elements of the periodic table, the things we understand has grown enormously. And for many of us, the circle of things that we don't understand is still substantial, but the things in that we don't understand, that we then say, well, that's God. For many of us, that circle is down to zero, because we've found it no longer necessary to say, I don't have to ascribe to the supernatural something that I simply don't yet understand.
Thanks.
We've got question number 5 at Friendly House.
Hi, my name is Eric, and this is actually my first time here. So hello. That's not necessarily a question, but one of the reasons that I came today was, the reason I came today was seeing that what your presentation was going to be on, and seeing that you were an ex-Adventist, which I found interesting. I grew up as a Seventh-day Baptist, which is even more obscure. And so when I left the faith about 15 years ago or so, I just really felt alone. And I would read stories. I'd read a Jehovah's Witness. I'd read maybe a method, different whatever. Never really connected with me because of my own experience was just my own experience. So I actually downloaded your book this morning and read the first chapters. I was already just pleased by what I'm seeing, just the experience of individuals, because that's what it comes down to is what are individuals experiencing. And my question then is, so you were in your late 30s, I think you said, when you
I was 37 when I hit the straw that broke this camel's back.
So if I do my math with my fingers, is that kind of pre-internet age?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's what I'm wondering is, are you seeing a difference in the people who come out? Has the internet and social media in particular impacted these or these leaving the faith stories, do you think, as opposed to maybe what happened up until the internet age?
Yeah, and really interesting. By the way, thank you. And I love the fact, curious enough to say, boom, I'm doing something about this. I'm getting it. I'm reading, and I only wish that it had been around 15 years ago when you were more in the middle of, because now you've reached on your own. You found more and more ways to be comfortable with your story, whether it still felt relatively alone. So,
okay, Doug, I want to ask you one last question. You kept to the subject of your studies very closely today. You didn't really try to go beyond what you have in the book, the stories that you have in the book. But I wanted to ask you to maybe extrapolate a little bit to get into something that would be meaningful for those of us who are already out of religion. What do we have to do? And the questions I have are, do we have to help people leave religion? And how would we do that? Or do we have to help people who have just left religion find something else? And how would we do that?
Thank you. Real practical and real. And I don't have a super condensed perfect answer to that. One, I have found it, in my case, best to be able to honestly say and mean it, hey, I'm not trying to make you into an atheist. To be able to reassure people of that. But then I say, but there's certain baggage that has historically gone with unmoderated faith that I'd like to bring to your attention. Can I? And most people will say, oh, okay, go ahead. And then I can hit those things. And by the way, I'm going to be back here on the 17th of December, where I'm not going to be just trying to introduce a book and highlight this and highlight that. I've got something deeply substantial, and I'm actually going to be turning pages as I go and try to. And I will touch on things we can do, though it borders on academic, but it's not really academic. In any case, I think, see, I mentioned one of the pieces of baggage that has gone with fundamentalist faith is that it's all in God's hands and we don't need to do anything about anything. And I'm going, that's an attitude we cannot sit passive about. We have to find constructive ways of communicating, of challenging. And I have some people have said to me, Matheson, you piss people off. And I'm going, I have long since accepted the risk that I might piss people off sometimes, but that fear hasn't zipped my lip. I've simply said, I never set out to be directly and deliberately offensive, even though I know that I will at times offend, because I rattle cages, I ruffle feathers, I step on toes, whatever illustration you choose to use. And I think we have to be willing to accept those risks. But because if we're passive about everything, we're going to be passive about climate change, we're going to be passive about a whole boatload of stuff. And guess what? We're going to be walking to our own graves, leaving one hell of a dumpster fire, ecologically and sociologically, to coming generations. And I find that irresponsible. I had two friends in Klamath Falls who read my first book. Sorry, I wrote a book about 12 years ago now, in which I titled Actually Thinking versus Just Believing. And those two friends, one an anesthesiologist and one a very successful businessman, they read my book and they said, Doug, you are a naive optimist. Everything you said in here is real, is true, but you think you can get people to think. Ha, ha, ha. They said, if you see darker, because
Okay.
as a young, 30 more seconds. I was in Beirut and saw blood in the streets. I was in Rwanda and saw bodies everywhere, and I can still smell it. I worry about the dumpster fire. And I'm really motivated to not be passive. And so I said to my two friends in Klamath Falls, you guys are telling me to build a bunker, get some land, build a place where you can survive chaos, because chaos is coming. I said, you guys are waving the white flag that your kids and grandkids and great-grandkids are going to live through Rwanda on steroids. And I'm not waving that white flag. I think there are things we can do to help grow a plurality. We don't ever have to really get to a majority. A plurality, the most influential middle of our society that can do better. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Doug. Okay. That thing about religion making us wait is, kind of reminds me of the Jehovah's Witnesses, which was, I have some people in my family were in Jehovah's Witness a couple of generations back, and they had on the masthead of their newspaper, millions now living will see the end, since 1914. And about 10 years ago, they dropped it. Something like that can only get truer if there's any truth in it. But they finally dropped it. Of course, and then St. Paul told the early church to, don't worry to have, don't have kids, because there's no time left. You won't be able to raise them till before Jesus comes back.